Right.
You can say your no, you can say
Don't click the right button.
It's working, but want more volume?
Yeah,
John, you might talk right into it.
Yeah. Okay. So my name's John Hall. I'm a member of the self-organized group Downtown Commons Advocates, and we're advocating for the creation of a public downtown commons and permanent farmers market, where the present farmers market is at the city-owned parking lot number 4 on Cedar Street between Lincoln and Cathcart. And let's see, I think we have some public officials here, and who are they?
Sandy Brown.
I'm here from the Downtown Commission, I heard, is it true? Brett Garrett, all right. Okay, thanks. So we're very fortunate to have with us tonight Mark Lakeman, who has gained national recognition for his work on community placemaking. Before I introduce Mark, I just want to say a few notes about what we'll be doing tonight. Our plan is to ask Mark to speak for about 45 minutes, then we'll break into small groups for half-an-hour discussions, and we encourage you in those small groups to ask 3 questions. First, does downtown Santa Cruz need a town commons?
yes.
Second, okay, that's going to bring you right on. And second, is lot number 4, the present farmers market, a good candidate for where a town commons might be? Why or why not? And third, what are the most important elements to have in a town commons? After the small group discussions, we'll ask you to come back to the larger group and report on your discussions. To begin, let me tell you a bit about my own interest in a downtown commons in Santa Cruz. My family and I moved here in 2011 from Davis, California, and there we had long appreciated Davis's Farmers Market, which is located in its central park. But I never knew how Davis's downtown public space came into being. What I recently found out is this. Everyone in Davis now recognizes what a wonderful community space and driver of economic vitality its Central Park and Market have become. But getting to that space and getting it to exist was a long political struggle. I will spare you the gory details. No one likes to see sausage being made. But here are 3 points that I think are especially relevant to Santa Cruz. First, the Davis Farmers Market is on the site of what was a former parking lot. Second, in order to create a permanent farmers market, its advocates had to win out over an alternative plan to construct a shopping center and parking garage on the parking lot. Third, despite an overwhelmingly positive citizens' ballot vote supporting the farmers market, the Davis City Council voted only 3-2 to move forward with expanding its Central Park and creating a permanent market facility. As it turns out, Mark Lakeman knows a great deal about political sausage making and the creation of public spaces. Based in Portland, Oregon, he's the design leader of the firm Communitecture and the co-founder of the City Repair Project. Communitecture is an architecture, planning, and design firm. It takes on projects to, quote, create beautiful and sustainable places that bring people together in community while respecting the needs and priorities of all the individuals, families, and groups and communities with which they work and play. The City Repair Project is a volunteer activist organization that, quote, facilitates artistic and ecologically oriented placemaking through projects that honor the interconnection of human communities in the natural world. Mark is someone who thinks deeply about places, people, history, and the possibilities of community. He has witnessed much the same struggle between a parking garage versus a public commons in the 1970s as people in Davis did in the 1980s faced, and we now face in Santa Cruz today. As Mark said, it's a choice between alternative potential destinies. Please welcome Mark Lakeman.
Well,
I just want to thank my hosts, thank Rick and John, and especially Dave, and everyone else who would have been helping to put on the event tonight, and definitely this wonderful venue. Towards that, I'm going to hand out these little disc-like stickers, which are featuring the logo of Santa Cruz Permaculture, which Dave is director of. So I'll just pass this over right here, and please just send it around. Yeah, it was an amazing thing to hear that people were contending with this issue, and I was being asked to come down and talk about it because it brought me back to some of my earliest memories, waiting for my father to come home when I was about 5, 6, and 7 to tell the update every evening in the saga of the creation of our great public commons, now one of the most beautiful public spaces in the world, considered to be one of the most beautiful. And as a young emerging consciousness, in the 60s, there were lots of worthy bedtime stories, some of them quite shocking, about great heroes being cut down as they were trying to lead our community toward a better alternative destiny. And locally, of course, people were marching in the streets just as they were around the country and also around the world in many cases. A lot of causes were rising, and they were starting to come into edges were touching. People were starting to build community across causes. And in Portland, for some reason, fairly early, I think, in the placemaking movement, it occurred to us that we needed to get a foothold in the new ways of seeing, in our cries for to speak freely. Like the emergence of this free speech movement motivated us somehow to realize that we didn't have a single public square. It was as if to say, what good is freedom of assembly without a place to assemble? And so the fight to create the first and only public square in the history of Portland, Oregon, was my bedtime story. And when I say that, I'm referring to my father. He was the founder of the urban design function of the Bureau of Planning in Portland, Oregon. And his job was to create some intelligence, some focus, some vision for the city, to have a kind of purpose and maybe some constraints, but also some things worth fighting for in the public realm. And the public square was to be the crown jewel. But in the way of that great public square were advocates that were just certain that it would become an 11-story parking garage instead. People have been talking about a public square for a long time. And at the same time, that urge to have a gathering place, I like to think of it as a gathering place where time, space, and life would not be for sale. What I mean by that is, people were awakening to the fact that we live in a colonial infrastructure in which from the beginning, as we moved across the West and expanded toward the Pacific Ocean, there was this really intense commodification of the world that was different than other countries experience. I'll be going into it a lot tonight. Why in the world do communities find themselves in such discussions? Why do we save our money to fly across the ocean, to see communities, to spend time there, to enjoy them, where there are so many gathering places that people talk to each other more often, and there are so many ways of interacting that people are compelled to get outside? And therefore, people's public health statistics in those communities are through the roof compared to ours. And their rates of violence between people, and I'm talking across the board from murder to suicide to hard drugs and even automobile accidents that are somehow affected by social isolation, ours are abysmal and through the floor compared to other nations. The thing is, when there are more public places, it's not just that you have more forums to interact. Certainly that's one of the most important aspects of it. But it turns out that when a commons is generated by the will of the community, and they somehow craft the design and then implement it in a meaningful way where people are actually using their hands, it creates a great story that propels the use of that space forward in time. And we have a lot of traumas in our society. It's not like we're going to start off with a perfect story and everything's going to go without any incident. But nonetheless, having such a basis from which to go forward into the future, where there is a nexus for gathering, for expression, for communication, for interaction, and certainly for trading like you do in something like a farmer's market, that's all wonderful. But the thing is, you can't just have some architect design it. It needs to be seeded, it needs to be planted in the community so that we identify strongly with it. We want to go there, we want to sustain it, we want to take people there and tell them our stories of the piece that we gave to it. And with all of the different pieces and threads that are planted and woven there, we treat it differently. We have more pride in it. It means more to us, and we'll sustain it longer. It gives us a chance. We have special problems in the USA because of our isolation, and we do have the fewest number of community gathering places of all first world nations. So we have a special design challenge. We have a national design challenge. Retrofitting the American landscape with places for people to gather is a greater challenge than in any other country across the spectrum of the world, and it has to do with how we were laid out. Most people don't even know about the National Land Ordinance of 1785 when the way that we would expand to the ocean was formulated. And it was formulated as a great document before the Declaration and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were even created. And yet few of us even know about it, and yet it proscribes the way that our land is developed according to a grid that organizes space, and that land is commodified automatically within that framework. Well, in places like Mexico and everything south, down into the southern hemisphere, you probably already know that they have plazas and zocolos everywhere. In fact, the Spanish version of our National Land Ordinance mandated that there be public spaces in every city and town, and you know that if you've been in those lands, south of the border here. Not so in our case. It was as if someone had a big giant whiteout and just said, nah, we don't really need gathering places going west. And I just think that's funny, because we had to fight with our lives to regain the commons in order to engage the British and fight for our autonomy and our national status as an independent country. Why so soon after we engaged that struggle did then some people decide that we would not have gathering places going west? Seriously, Portland, Oregon's great gathering place I'm going to show you stories about tonight, it's only about 30 years old because we had to put it in after 150 years of being there. We didn't have even one public square. So those were my bedtime stories, the struggle to create a great public space. And the back and forth, the great mayor that tried to institute it. And then Jimmy Carter took him and put him in charge of the National Transportation Administration for all the great things that he was doing with mass transit in our region. And then the new mayor that came in and literally said, I'm not going to let that public square happen, because if I do, you'll gather. And he said that on TV, which was really a big mistake, because that weekend, an enormous number of people showed up on the rooftop of the two-story parking garage that we all wanted to take down and make a great gathering place out of. And we literally painted the rooftop with this fabulous concept that this community had already selected. So the mayor was trying to stop something that had great momentum. But we applied paint, and we haven't stopped since. I'll show you more about that. This is just an oak tree from your region. Thought it'd be a nice way to start. So, if we just live in the priorities and kind of the accounting spreadsheet of what a developer feels like funding, then we may never know what it means to have a community gathering place in our midst. And I say that as an architect who works with developers all the time, but I tell you, the developers I work with are ones that don't just build product, they build a legacy. They build a place where people will actually care about each other and talk. There's a greater spectrum of consideration, and certainly a greater program for community. They're not just building houses, in vast housing tracts. They're building community infrastructure as best they can. My friend Lydia Dolman, who's an activist in our region, a public space activist, she has said, if people who basically can't, if men who can't even tell their wives they love them much less hug each other, lay out the world we live in. No wonder it's not sustainable or even much fun. What chance would we have? So here we are, thinking of homes as repetitious units. Okay, I can see why all of that happens. I can understand why you would want an economy of scale. I understand everything about the design processes and the implementation and the funding related to all of these kinds of considerations. And yet I tell you, in America, because we treat human landscapes more as commodities than as community places, we design our own problems.
Right.
I am really done flying across the ocean to see places where intergenerational community plays out in public space, where people are absolutely safe and children do not end up on a milk carton, and the rest of us feel constant anxiety because of the danger to children. This is unnecessary, and I say to you that it's a consequence of design. Men should grow up within the embrace of a community where they are mentored to be responsible and accountable citizens, and then have a place in the community, have a role, be mentored to become a young man, and then a responsible father, or some spectrum of possibilities like that. And what I am doing right now is naming the fact that men who look a lot like me end up hurting our society more than any brown people, and certainly more than women do. And I think it's completely unnecessary. My own father, the great planner who was behind our public square, he called me a couple of years ago after reading a bunch of articles that I've been trying to get him to look at for years, and he said, I realized as a planner I really did contribute to the breakdown of families. I really did participate in the idea that everyone has to leave where they live at the start of the day, to leave the home zone, to go to the work zone, which fractures the family at the very beginning of the day. And at the end of the day, people are too tired to really engage with their neighbors, much less their own children. So planning has contributed to the fragmenting of the American family. And when we travel to places like this, we don't see such incredible, intense design of other people's landscape. We see much more of an integration. Where do we think we got the idea of mixed-use planning, that living and working should be within a close proximity so people can know the people that they live and work with, and be more healthful as they move around using their own body instead of cars? So these spectacular places that we go to see aren't just absolutely wonderful because they're ancient and kind of archaeological, therefore. When we spend enough time there, we realize, oh my God, the people and the place are integral. And what they've done is designed as a social process. They barely even needed architecture because of the shared intelligence of people who are resident in that place across time. And this is one of the great revelations for Americans, to realize that the village isn't really about the stuff, it's about the life force of humanity that resides there. If that continuity is broken, then all we have left are artifacts and fragments that fall into ruin. But if somehow we focus on the life force, and we cultivate and we mentor and we do all of these good things that our ancestors did to get us here, then we'll be okay. Just want to remind you of this. This is from one of our great sort of teachers in Portland, Oregon, who just wants to remind everyone that human habitat is supposed to build community constantly. Public space isn't just for the movement of goods and services. It's supposed to invite us to come outside and interact and use our bodies and be an interesting environment so that we are compelled to interact with each other with less fear. Looking at some of the great villages in the world, you can see, if you look very closely at this aerial view of this Dogon village in Mali, which is just about the best example in the world, that they actually do have a connectivity network. They have primary, secondary, and tertiary streets, all the great things that we love about the grid. But the revelation is that a transportation network doesn't have to be a bunch of boxes and straight lines. It can actually be geomorphic, and it can adapt to the land as it shields you from the wind, and as it captures the light, and as it captures the rain, and lets it flow somewhere where you want to use it. All those good things are possible, but only if the intelligence of the local community is engaged. And by God, that is what we mean by democracy, after all. Okay, so let's look at the fact that we have to retrofit Western cities with public squares. And I hope I don't sound like I'm belly aching too much, because I really want us to get on to the idea that activism can be constructive. Like, we're not just here to complain about what's wrong, we're here to do something about it. And that's what democracy really is. It's not just voting and assigning a budget and having other people carry it out while we go about jobs that we don't even really care about. It's more than that. It's to engage with each other and make decisions and enact projects on a daily basis at best. So here we are looking at a typical Western, sort of West Coast city, and in this case it's Portland, Oregon, but looking at it, how could you tell? I mean, it could be St. Louis, it could be Chicago. In fact, everything, especially west of the Ohio River, was laid out on paper according to the National Land Ordinance. We literally blueprinted Roman colonial planning as the method for expanding to the West Coast. Here we are looking at our famous two-story parking garage in Portland, Oregon. We had a glorious hotel here designed by the architects McKim, Mead, and White. It was the most beautiful piece of architecture in the history of Portland, and that was torn down to make room for this two-story parking garage. So we had already learned that change was possible. The question was, who's deciding how change will proceed? And I think our destiny rests on that tipping point. Who decides? Whose will? So many different people were talking about what could possibly happen on this two-story, where this two-story parking lot was. This was the focus because it was the 100% corner. This was the center of the city where the most activity was happening. There were those that said, no, we need more parking. We need more parking because we have a parking challenge, and the more parking we have, the more people will come downtown. And I respect that argument. I think it's a reasonable argument. And at the same time, there were other people who said, what we need is a cultural magnet. Downtown is dying, not so much because of an absence of parking, but because of the expansion of sprawl, which is eating up forest land and consuming farmland. We need a place that is so attractive that people want to come downtown. We need a cultural space. And after all, we don't have one freaking public square in the entire city, So we had all kinds of workshops. All kinds of people were drawing and creating models, and kids in high schools were trying out ideas, and the mayor was trying to stop them. We had an international competition with some of the most famous architects in the world, and we selected a winner, and everyone was excited, and then the new mayor tried to kill it, as I said. So on that day, we went out, that he said that we couldn't gather. We went on the rooftop of the two-story parking garage, and we literally painted it with the winning design. And right about this moment, the mayor shows up and says, you can't do that. I'm the one with all the power in the city. You stop painting. And meanwhile, while he wasn't looking, we painted his car. And I'm very happy to tell you we threw him out in the next election cycle and replaced him with a tavern over there that looked amazingly like Santa Claus. Bud Clark, the most beloved person in the history of the city, who changed our destiny. He broke the back of the Old Boy Network that was basically a very fear-based culture that was making lots of decisions on behalf of everyone else, mostly to their own benefit and to the exclusion of community infrastructure. So they created the pressure that led to this moment. So we have this incredible public square. Some people say it's the 7th most beautiful. I don't know how they figured this out. There must be some sort of XY graph of some kind, but it's our story, and we're in love with this square. We're so in love with this square that even when the mayor said, I'm cutting the budget, you have no money. Ha ha ha. You know what we did then? First I gotta tell you though, this square was designed to be meaningful. Like the great architect Will Martin who designed it, he had found in his travels a place where a great Roman arch had fallen into the hill in this little Greek village that the Romans had taken over and subjugated. And the fallen Roman arch was overflowing with a spring that was flowing down the hill over the ruins. And he thought, that symbol of renewal is so appropriate for us too. So he recreated that in the space. And when the mayor said, no, you can't have that, he didn't understand how much people had fallen in love with the vision of renewal and of gathering. So yeah, water needs to burst and flow, and people need to hear the playfulness of water in public space. When you go to Portland, walk on this public square and look at how everywhere you go, you will see the names of the Portlanders who stood up against the mayor and said, no, we will buy every piece of this square with the money in our pockets. I think this is where it came from, to buy a brick to support a public space. Anyway, that's what happened in our town. Whole families, have their names registered here. The thing about it is, it's fundamentally a crossroads. It's also a multifunctional space. It accommodates all kinds of different things to happen. Just like this great commons is possibly a place where the farmer's market will be functional, it will also need to be able to accommodate so many other kinds of things that will happen, and therefore it will be more socially sustained, and it will be more economically sustained, and it will have the resources to be maintained, and it will just have layers and layers of use and meaning accumulating like a great patina over time. All around the edges are these wonderful spaces, subspaces. Like there's a great central space, and then there's great subspaces all the way around the perimeter. You look at the parts and pieces, there's ways that people are sheltered, there's places for them to sit, there's ways to get food, all the things that you would want to see happen in a great public space. There's wonderful architectural elements that create some complexity and interest and wonderful shadows that play across the texture. In this case, very brilliantly, the architects brought the rhythm of the columns on the face of the buildings over here on the ground level and projected them forward into the public square so that you would relate these columns to the wall across the street with the same structural rhythm as the building has behind it. So the overall kind of urban space would have a coherence, that there would be a language, that it would all be talking, there would be a rhythm like that which compels you when you're listening to music. And then special details. These are roses because Portland is known famously as the city of roses, but on these roses you found bugs, little beetles and ladybugs and things. So there was a sense of humor embedded in it as well. Then wonderful sort of weather telling machines and shadow casting devices and other kinds of public art. And taking this ruin metaphor even farther, the idea that columns don't always need to stand. Why not let a few of them fall down before it actually becomes a ruin itself? And then the base of the column becomes a place for people to play chess and other games. Of course, such a space needs to have transportation so that people are coming to it and leaving it without the needing to use cars. So such great spaces obviously need to be connected to the arteries and veins of movement in the region. Places to shelter people as they're waiting for transportation. And in this case, we've got bikes and buses, all kinds of pedestrian access, and then lots and lots of bike parking and light rail. But then it's spectacular. It's spectacular annually. It's spectacular seasonally. It's spectacular in a way that you always can rely on it and plan your family time around, so you can always go there, even for sacred rituals. Sometimes it's a wonderful festival that has to do with art and beauty or nature. Sometimes it's a farmer's market. Sometimes it's a freaking gigantic world record yoga activity. Other times it's watching the World Cup. Other times it's a great political gathering where the mayor is speaking to the people. Other times it's a sandcastle making contest or something. But the thing that is most wonderful about these spaces isn't what they're programmed to do. It's the incidental. It's the way that it's always available. In fact, surveys of such spaces, one of my favorite ones comes from a young woman, about 11 years old, and she says in this sort of part of her survey, a written piece, she said, "It makes me feel like the whole city is my home." That's exactly what we're talking about. Then we win. Then we all win. When it affects our dreams, and we feel that there is at last a place where time and space is not for sale. Which brings us to my favorite little metaphor here. This is what we've been creating in Portland. It isn't even a public square as much as it is a culture of partnership and intention and the will to do anything. So we found ourselves in a landscape of placelessness, basically on the grid, feeling like we're all isolated and separated, as you do when you play the game of kings. But in this game, for some reason, two of the pawns have decided to trade sides and talk to the other pawns on the other side. And in the middle, as they pass each other, they start by apologizing. These must be community organizers or something. They start off by saying, "I'm so sorry for what happened in that last game. We came out, we attacked you, and you attacked us. The tall, oppressive ones with funny hats behind us, they came out and attacked each other. We all end up dying. The game is designed to end. It's designed to be unsustainable." So they're talking to the other pawns, and the pawns are saying, "Well, but you're asking us to change what we do. This is our job. We can't get out of our boxes." So fortunately, they managed to get into small groups with facilitators. They're sitting there talking about their childhoods and their oppressive conditions, how they're all isolated. And then they get upset and they go to the back row and they're saying, "Hey, you guys are always taking more than your share. You know, we're always working so hard and we have so little in the way of a community amenity and we all feel so isolated where we live, and these guys are like, what are you talking about? We never take more than our share. So the pawns get upset, push the other guys off the board, and that's what normally happens, you know? And then people end up recreating the same dynamics of polarization, and that is not what has been happening in the last few decades. It's looked a lot more like this, with people saying, oh, come on, let's get out of, we're always talking about getting out of the box and thinking outside the box. You know, you fools, let's get out of the box. Come on now, let's see if we can see each other's face. So they all are talking about their ideas and wanting to help each other and volunteer. And some people say, I have way more than my share. I think I could donate something. And stuff starts to happen. Meanwhile, on the other chessboards, they start to hear that this one has begun to act up. The kings and queens are getting nervous. They're like, oh no, the pawns are figuring out how the game works. We might have to get out of bed before 10, you know? And the pawns realize that at last the time has come. Meanwhile, back on the first board, they're totally rocking out the place. They're having a little harvest festival. They got 3 Asian pears and a squash. They finally got some furniture, so they have a dining room table. Apparently this is a video player, a little rocket stove over here. They've got a couple of hot tubs. And they planted a perennial landscape. What you're seeing is a little bit of urban permaculture here, where people are basically trying to make the mundane, the miraculous. And let's just face it, that's the story of this whole freaking planet. Even your most boring moment is a miracle compared to everything else we can see for light years around us. I like to see it that way when I get out of bed, like, yes, another day. That's how Portland, Oregon is. Like, look at these people. They created the public square, and this is its opening day. Our square, our great public living room. How much can it mean? Now we have them all over the city. There are 700 intentional communities that have radicalized public spaces across the city, and I'll show you a little bit more about it. But you don't just need a few. There needs to be an entire network, a fabric, almost like living tissue, that moves throughout all of the places where people live, that helps people to connect with those around them. It's like this, that the proclivity that we all have for problem solving, like that gets met by the problems around us. And then we build community through addressing those challenges, and we surmount them and move on to more interesting problems. That's the concept, and that's what our ancestors have been doing for literally thousands of years before we found ourselves in this colonial infrastructure of isolation. After all, by God, it is our nature to be this way. In fact, it is our birthright to create place, to be place makers, is who we are. This little picture here, I'm sorry it's not looking so good on this particular projection, but this is an image that was drawn by some of our interns of what Portland is beginning to look like as we implement the ordinances that we've already established for the revolutionizing of the public sphere. Street trees everywhere, now fruit trees everywhere, now nut trees everywhere, and you can grow food in every residential right-of-way for free, free of permit, all over the city. You can install interactive kiosks that children design and build, and you just put them in and you're automatically permitted and insured for doing it. You don't even have to fill out a form. That's how our political leadership feels about it. They're like, we just need to get out of the way because everything's going right. This is the destiny of our town. We've already done all the hard work. Now we just have to play more often. So what's the point? Ever since I was a little kid, what's the point of all this work that we're doing? There must be some vision to bind us together. And this is my best guess. I think this is what it's about. I love green roofs. I love bioswales. I love, super energy efficient buildings. I love, effective, collaborative, horizontal structured, community infrastructure of decision making. Love all those things. But I think the point of it is all to get us to where anyone can love whoever they want, wherever they are right now. I think that's the point that all of this is leading to.
Yes.
Freedom, actually.
Yes.
And the return of our sensibilities, so that we want to actually have nature in and around us everywhere. And to reject the great modernists like Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe, who said, no, actually nature and humanity must be separate, and so the built environment has to express the distinction between humanity and nature. Do you realize we have been dealing with that by design for the last century? No thanks anymore, actually. So let us create habitat for all of these distressed species all around us where we live. And let us begin to come to grips with the fact that the dynamics of change always seem to be driven externally. We need an economy, we need it to be resilient, and we also need it to be regenerative. Why don't we do more to drive the processes of change than to just accommodate it, receive it, and maybe even work for it, maybe even drive the backhoe that destroys the homes around us? We can drive the processes of change. In fact, we all work in the institutions that we're so frustrated with. So something about organizing locally to make decisions and have power obviously is what we must do. Now, I'm coming from a place of lots and lots of background and qualification when I talk about this. The idea that there needs to be participatory cultures with a much more humanistic view that is much more collaborative with nature as a whole permeates all of the work that we do, and it makes everything better and more interesting and attractive and fundable, frankly. So everything wins when we have this kind of formula. Here we are redesigning the infrastructure of San Francisco, the water infrastructure, to convert the way that people get rid of water and dump it in the bay into a way to capture the water and save it, because we've got a freaking extended drought, you know?
Yes.
And then utilizing all of these things that we already know how to do around basically gray water, black water, water catchment, bioswales, all this stuff to either capture it and reuse it,
Yes.
or regenerate it and then deposit it in the water table where we can use it again. So that's for San Francisco, as funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, to try to help the Bay Area become resilient against climate change. Mare Island at the north end of the bay, to convert 3 million square feet of residual, well, just absolutely abandoned naval architecture, in order to bring together lots of problems like, wow, there's all these people living in the street who are desperate. There's all this desperate need for the creation of technologies that will help us to adapt to and survive climate change. There's all this architecture that could actually be housing people and functions. Bring all those things together to reinvent the island as an incubator where people can live, have living wage jobs, live with their families, and also create the regenerative technology that we desperately need to meet this impending, this approaching deadline, 2030, that is basically requiring us to go to an extreme level of carbon reduction. This is just a cross-section through the island. The whole thing's been designed. The repurposing of all this architecture and basically making it into a living farm. And then for Vallejo, redesigning the fabric of the neighborhoods collaboratively with the residents to figure out how to create place-making fabric that turns each block into a village, with all of the different systems they would need in order to capture and treat their water and also their human waste, to generate electricity and heat hot water using the sun, to generate food with annual and perennial systems, to have infill affordable housing to augment what they already have, and then consider how all of that works together to rejuvenate and revitalize their economy with a much stronger local basis. And then scale it the freak up. Okay, so one of my favorite things to do is to go around the city serving free chocolate cake in this butterfly-shaped truck in order to get people to hold hands around the entire city of Portland. And I'm not doing that alone. We're doing that as an organization. Because at a certain point we went, oh no, like there's no public squares across the city. You know, what are we going to do? We need to bring people together in order to become more creative, to become activists with a more, with a greater creative, constructive intention. Like, we need freaking weapons of mass construction right now. So a little bit of acquainting of each other, just to touch for a minute on World Peace Day, every solstice, to unite the city. And then that leads to these spectacular projects, like this building has the highest recycled and natural content of all architecture in the USA. In fact, the facility itself is taking stuff from the waste stream, reconditioning it, and sending it back to the community. I'm talking about old 2x4s becoming denailed and made available for pennies on the dollar. But the thing itself is a public square, but it's as if it's alive. And the focus isn't so much the building, it's on the people who work there and their connection to the surrounding community. You walk inside the Rebuilding Center and you see all of this sort of spectacular spectrum of things that are available to people. If you are a nonprofit, you can come here and haul as much of this away for free as you can twice a year for your projects. The Capaces Institute, the most energy efficient office building built largely by children as a training facility inspired by Cesar Chavez, and this is the first of a national network. These are all the essence of the public square and its and its function to create fusion and relationships and inspiration is basically the spirit behind all the projects I'm showing you here. All these infill co-housing projects are all small villages built around common space. What I'm saying is the idea that we create a commons in a downtown, it makes sense everywhere that we find ourselves spending time with other human beings. Whether it's the de facto coffee maker at our job, or any kind of circumstance, people need a space that is a commons that they all feel comfortable in, where they feel as if they have a sense of ownership. This is a permaculture landscape built to help people with Asperger's to come to grips with their challenges. And this is basically a spectacular application of permaculture, but every bit about the commons, in fact, the entire landscape. It's not like you're compartmentalizing the commons into one focused place. The entire landscape, in this case, is seen as a commons, available to everyone who is there, so it breaks the bounds of the public square and releases it. I think it's time that everything that we design is a model for addressing climate change. Socially, in terms of minimizing the need even at all for transportation, so that people can basically use their bodies to move to and fro and therefore become more healthy. When we were looking at retrofitting the city with public squares, we looked at the fact that the typical Portlander had to move all across the landscape just to get their needs met every day. And instead we asked ourselves, how much more could we accomplish if we enabled people to be connected to those around them? I mean, first of all, we would accomplish the absolute minimization of our ecological impact on the world by, to a great extent, eliminating the need to even move around the landscape if living and working were localized, and we could actually work with the people right where we live. There's a lot to say about this, but looking at the circumstance we're in, where everyone leaves at the start of the day to go elsewhere to earn their livelihood, and yet you realize that everyone here has skills and talents, and they actually all have needs. It starts to seed the idea that maybe we could actually work with each other. So this was our retrofit strategy for public squares in general, to give the public sphere the right of way, a broader diversity of uses at selected intersections. So along with that was a vision. How can we make it so that it's easy for people to trade with each other? Like maybe a weekly garage sale, for instance. And then maybe projects on the corners becoming more elaborate. Like here's a little flower shop, here's a little cafe, here's a place for books and produce and fruit and vegetables. Here's a fountain over here on the corner that's just beautiful for no other reason. And then it starts to grow, and people start saying, well, why flee the city when I have a relationship with everyone around me? Perhaps where I am right now can become sacred as well. This is very blotchy looking in this slide, but this came about from a workshop where in this neighborhood they asked themselves, what would world peace look like? And they took an afternoon to actually talk to each other. And of course everyone's out walking and talking and biking. And they don't even have a need for using cars because they've connected their skills and talents together. And this is what it actually looks like. This is that same location where they got started by converting the street intersection into a public square. Now, if you think that's a weird idea, let's go back to before 1920, when the most important thing that happened in the streets of the USA were the birthday parties of combined families that filled residential space, where all these people would come out and have their children have birthdays together if they were within the same month. And what about the thousands of years before that time, before cars existed, when public space was much more of a multi-use environment? What we're talking about in the installation of these is not just space and also activity, it's the restoration of an effect that we still call the barn raising, where people come together and go shoulder to shoulder, not just to build, but then to make food and mentor children and dance together into the night, and then probably kiss after that. So when we did that, and we did it actually without permission. The city council loved it so much, they legalized it for everyone to do across the city to an unlimited number of street intersections for free. Because we made a case. We said, look, we have the highest crime rates in all the world and the lowest number of gathering places. There's a direct correlation. And on that basis, they legalized it. So again, it is a national issue. But where are we now? It was that public square I showed you first was the catalytic stroke for the region. Because of what it has done to how we interact with each other, both functionally and symbolically, we now have the most bike commuters and the most bike lane miles by far of all North American cities. We have the most farmers markets, more than 50 across the city, every week. We have the most green buildings, and we even have transportation bureaucrats illegally putting banana slugs on their own bike lane markers, and I think that's really special. We also have the first major bridge in the entire USA that accommodates all forms of transportation except for cars. So the magic here, like the icing on this cake, is to focus on building community through every manner of project, not upon the project, but upon the life force of the community. You must have heard of the music, arts, and food culture of Portland, Oregon. It is like nothing seen before in this continent. The shortest distance between where food is grown and where it's eaten of all communities. Oh, this is our great big naked bike ride that sets a new world record every year. Probably shouldn't show you that, actually. Yeah, we do that because people love their city. You hear people saying, I love this place. And I want to caution you, we have had a lot of problems. Oregon was basically conceived of as a white supremacist homeland. So the most beautiful part of Portland, Oregon is that out of the rot of that kind of mentality has emerged this rebirth of the story of this place, to intentionally take basically the destiny of what it would have otherwise become and redirect it towards something much more worthy. And it's expanding across the region to protect farm and forest lands with our famous urban growth boundaries, concentrating density along transit routes, about the smartest formulation for managing growth that you could conceive of. But again, the thing we're growing is our children, to become leaders with a vision and a sense of belonging like most Americans deserve but don't get to have. The leaders we're growing. Like this young woman said, let's install bioswales along the edges of streets and let the water sheet off in order to decentralize remediation of water, to save ourselves billions of dollars while we bank water into the water table. And fortunately, the adults in Portland said, hell yes, let's do what she said. All of this ways of growing food across the city because a few elder women got together, to make it free and easy to get a permit in order to grow food in the residential right-of-way. Fruit and nut trees, as I said, whole orchards, urban orchards, repurposing yards to become community-supported agriculture. Of course, there are green roofs and beehives everywhere. Of course, people are actually combining their water overflow from their homes on their blocks to create, like instead of going elsewhere to steward a watershed, steward your own damn watershed on your block. That's the idea. With gray water and water catchment along the way. Here's an entire block charting its destiny to confront climate change and inspire the other blocks of the Roman colonial grid. It's now free to put in little free libraries all over the city. You don't even need a permit. Any kind of interactive little kiosk is free and automatically insured by order of the city council. Children building raised planters in the right-of-way in order to constrict traffic flow and provide habitat to distressed bee populations. What kind of transportation bureau are we looking at here? We're looking at one that is fully awake and helping cities all over the continent to make similar transitions, to become more intentional and more diverse, and frankly, to help them have more fun in their jobs. Okay, all this stuff is free. You can do all this stuff in public space. Everywhere
I want
you
to go
like.
back to Oregon with you.
Okay, we'll put you on the roof.
Okay.
The homeless villages that we have been, people here in Santa Cruz want to talk about this. We've been helping homeless villages all across the country. This is the first one in the nation, Dignity Village, started in 1999. This is what it looks like. Tiny home neighborhoods, lowest carbon footprint of all, costs 25 times less than a government shelter, does not break families apart. It has the lowest crime rate in all the city for years at a time as measured by the police, and the benefits literally go on and on. It repairs people and sends them back to their family whole. Another kind of homeless village where homeless people take care of other homeless people. This is called the Kenton Women's Village, with super energy efficient homes where you practically sweat just by having one person in there. This is bringing architecture to the rescue and beauty. This is for only veterans in a very conservative little city called Oregon City, about 20 miles south. Little units for the veterans. It's just like this. People talk about the fact that there should have been a village square, and then there is one, damn it. They're all over the place. They're happening all over, not just our city, but cities all across the country, up into Canada, and other countries of the world. Here's a congressional delegation from Washington, D.C. to come see what in the world is going on and how it's bringing people together. all these different communities, each with their own metaphor, with their own ideas, their own processes of installing. And the point is to have a massive impact and inspire people to get off the couch and wrestle with the issues of our time and win. There you go. Does anyone, Rick may have a plan here.
Yeah.
I think Rick has the plan.
Yeah.
Hi, folks. I'm Rick Longinati.
Yay.
Thank you. When we organize an event like this, we're taking a risk. You know, we don't know if anybody's going to show up and whether we can afford to compensate Mark. And so we put the entrance admission at a rate that we thought wouldn't discourage people from coming. But we need to ask for a collection to pass on to Mark to help compensate him for coming down from Portland. So I'll pass this around. And then, Lisa, do you want to introduce the next? I'll do this. Yeah, make it out to the campaign for sustainable transportation, because the group, the Downtown Commons Advocates, doesn't have a bank account yet.
And are you talking about, okay, great. So, we do have a half an hour at this point, and a whole bunch of you here, and after hearing this marvelous talk, we have a few questions we're suggesting that we can break into smaller groups to discuss. You're welcome to come up with your own questions and topics as well, but some of these questions are, does downtown need a town commons? Number one. Number two, is lot number 4, which is the current farmer's market lot, a good candidate for a town commons downtown? And then why or why not? And a third topic or question would be, what are the most important elements to have in a town commons downtown? So,
Can we ask Mark?
Q&A.
would you like a Q&A
Yes.
with Mark also? Thank you.
Mark, have you seen our cute little tiny town square by our town clock downtown here?
I have been all over downtown and been quite charmed by a lot of things about this place, for sure.
What our city has been doing lately is putting up more and more fences, like around this
Yes.
place right here. So I don't know how it's possible to go from all these fences, and I think the fear is, the reason the fences are to
Homeless.
keep people that are unhoused out of those areas. So I don't know how we can have that, because then everyone in the neighborhood's gonna start complaining about people that are unhoused coming to their little square.
Yeah. Okay, so I should comment on that. Okay, I want to tell you a story. I've been working on these issues for a long time, and I understand that some people are afraid. I also know that there are good reasons to be afraid. I also know that there's a lot of projection, and some people exploit fear. Some people don't care. And then there are a lot of people who really do care, and they're frustrated and they feel helpless. So this is my entry. That painted intersection, that first one, that's not too far from where I live. And before we painted that intersection, something happened that was remarkable, and it propelled me into this issue forever, and I will not walk away. We built a little tea station on the corner. We called it the 24-hour solar-powered self-service tea station. And it was in the beginning, it was just a branch stuck in the ground, piece of plywood with a little piece of cloth over it and a bucket for dirty cups. And we just drove nails into basically it was a lodgepole pine, made a kind of an umbrella effect with some visqueen. And the point was kind of to just work with crap in order to make it an amazing and magical thing. But nobody knew what it was for like a day. And then Anne Marie, an elder Catholic woman that helped to build it, she told me a story at the end of the second day of the first use, the first tea that was made at our little, I'm talking about a little pump thermos and some cups. And there was our little radicalization of public space just sitting there. And I know that people were walking by, driving by and looking at it like it was the weirdest thing. The condo owners down on the waterfront, actually. So at the end of the second day, I came home and Anne Marie flagged me down and she wanted to tell me a story. And she said, that guy that is always down in the blackberries? I finally know who he is. So she told me the story. Earlier that day, a young man in his early 30s walked up to the tea station and he was looking around and he decided to make himself some tea. And he was holding his tea as he was looking. He seemed to be searching. So she called out from her porch about 40 feet away and she said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "Well, I hope so. I keep coming back and it's hopeless at this point, but I'm looking for my brother. I was 7 when my parents were both killed in a car accident. And my brother was 6, and we were sent to separate relatives, but he never made it. So I keep coming back, because we lived in this neighborhood. We lived right here, and I've never seen him since." And about that time, this man comes pushing a shopping cart up the sidewalk and stops and starts to make himself a cup of tea. And this is a homeless man, been living in the blackberry bushes the whole time I'd lived in the neighborhood. He was just the weird guy down in the blackberries. And as he's listening to this story, he calls out his brother's name.
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
oh no. A 6-year-old was living in the freaking blackberries because for some reason Americans couldn't ask him if he needed help.
Good God.
So his 7-year-old brother finally comes back to him, and thanks to a piece of crap on a corner with a pump thermos, they managed to connect with each other. And that's a beautiful, heartwarming story. And maybe that means we need little tea stations everywhere. But what it said to me was, every freaking day, in every neighborhood where we all live, stories are trying to come together again, and they're not. It also means that there are things going on behind closed doors within only a few houses from us that we know nothing about that we should be involved with, and I'm talking about domestic violence for sure. Stuff is happening and stuff is not happening. Stuff is desperately not getting to happen in our communities. So when I'm working on that was my entry into public issues related to homelessness. I was like, I know nothing. I spent a whole life hearing about boogeymen and being made to be afraid of people living in the streets. Here's another thing. I was in Boulder, Colorado a few months back, and somebody told me that they had just met the great-granddaughter of Albert Einstein, a homeless woman in Denver, Colorado. I'm like, who in the world are we that this is happening? Oh, she's just lazy? Or maybe she's having revelations about the movements of the heavens. She's like, no, I can't work at 7-Eleven right now. I'm figuring out E does not equal MC squared after all, I mean, I don't even know how to think of this. It's just that the truth is everybody out there either was serving their country and had part of their body blown off, or they're a woman on a fixed income and she can't afford where she was living anymore, or there's a family with children living in a car. They desperately need our help. And then there are people with pathologies that can't be managed and they need some special circumstances. But thanks to Ronald Reagan, there's almost none of that anymore. So they desperately need our help. And it's time to stop treating them as problems and start treating them as our species, and rather than fencing off space, they need to be engaged. I mean, there's this fundamental principle that we all better place our bets on, because we don't know what's going to happen in the short-term future with this political administration, and the fact that the majority of Americans are one paycheck away from poverty. They're ourselves. So, is there a paradigm in which we can solve our own problems? Is there a paradigm in which we can take care of ourselves? I mean, just stepping back even farther, who in the world decided that nomadicism was illegal? You know, it reminds me of the parable of Cain and Abel, where Cain, whose name means colonial city-state, kills his brother, whose name means ephemeral nomadic village. Do you know that's an allegory for colonialism? Like Cain kills Abel so nobody gets to live on free space anymore and everyone has to pay for the square they live on. You know, that little story, that's what that means. And I don't think that's okay. I don't think we ever got to vote on that one. So I could obviously go on forever about that.
We have a beautiful river that flows through our town, and I didn't see strong slides that showed some connections that happen in Portland around the river. Could you just say a few things about waterways?
Yeah, let's see. Mean about respecting them and the biodiversity, the communities of biodiversity along their edges. I happen to be really appreciative of the ways that we protect environments and keep ourselves away as if we are automatically a threat. And I understand why we've been instituting policies in order to protect the broadest diversity of species. And at the same time, I think we're also ready to start acting like stewards and gardeners again, where we're able to have a more intimate interface, especially in urban areas. I think it helps promote more active stewardship to enable people to come closer to edges. So with really sensitive design, I'm actually talking right now about a project that we've been working on, a memorial to a great public space activist named Barbara Walker, where we are coming right up to the edge of a local stream with this public space installation and kind of nestling people in amongst these native food forests where the trees are literally being woven together like structures, almost like living architecture. So I think that the interface can be more creative than we've allowed ourselves to think of, but I don't know that I'm answering your question.
And you in the back?
Yeah, so, in 2003, or in that time period, some friends and I got together and started a group called Downtown Commons. And we were trying to do exactly this. And we got stymied by downtown market people or merchants who were worried about the negative element that would come into the commons. And pretty much got totally squashed. There was a spot that we thought that would be good where the earthquake happened. There was a building and we were trying to make that happen. So what I would like is the homeless question or the unhoused question again, but to the merchants, to the people who we have now we even have like quadruple the number of people who are unhoused in this town. And what happens downtown and the merchants have really suffered because nobody comes downtown supposedly because they're afraid of the negative elements.
Yeah.
So I would like you to be, I'm a merchant, I'm telling you this, what would you say to me?
Well, there's examples that I could cite. There's appeals that I could make. Eventually, I guess I'm going to cite an example. The Central East Side Industrial Council of Portland has been the most aggressive business entity in the city around kind of taking a punitive approach to public space in their district. And after basically denying that there's a problem and trying to police it out of existence, the overwhelming number of homeless people that are now in the streets has brought them to a place where they realize that ignoring the problem and attacking people and basically, and then also some recent court decisions that decriminalize being homeless have helped. But it's brought this business entity to the point where they realized that at this point they have to become creative. They have to do things to be more proactive and even preemptive. So instead of fighting houseless villages, they're actually starting to create them. And, I think that's really, I'm really happy. But I've been part of a group trying to persuade them for the last 20 years to care and to realize that by addressing the problem creatively, that you can probably do something about it as opposed to just constantly reacting. So now they're ready, but the number of people is overwhelming. And the amount that they're ready to do is underwhelming. It's not enough. And you know, there's an advisory council. I sometimes get to participate in it with our mayor, and we've just been saying to him over and over again, everything's getting worse, and it's not going to get better anytime soon. We need space. The Department of Transportation has lots and lots of space, and they're the only landholder with enough space to house all of these people, and the more and the rest of the people that are going to come soon. So I don't know. That's a bunch of logic, but it's also a story of people that are now taking real action. They're creating real relationship with homeless leaders and the village, like designers and coordinators. They're actually hammering out plans. So it's probably too little, too late in some ways, but it's going to build momentum. They're going to inspire lots of other people and lots of other business councils. Hopefully they'll freaking come to their own rescue soon.
Question, is the real estate as hoary, greedy as ours, as California?
It's probably one step back in terms of how intense it is here, but it's become obscene.
Yeah.
Sandy?
For the talk, it's really good to be here listening to some positive things that we can do, and rather than, we spend a lot of time as activists trying to stop things from happening. So I think everybody in this room is probably aware that there's a proposal for using this block that was suggested about before, which could be a beautiful downtown commons, as a library parking garage. And the powers that be of the city have worked very hard to move that vision and that plan forward. We have a moment right now where we might actually be able to have that decision revisited. I was on the council when the decision was made to move forward in that way. I'm on the council now, and we have a different makeup on our elected body. So there's an opportunity. And rather than just going to the powers that be and say, well, we're going to kill that idea, we really want, or at least I do, I think my colleagues do as well, to come back and say, here's how we want you to revisit, how we want to revisit the question of the use of that site. So I am very much interested in how that sausage gets made. If you had some recommendations on, what are kind of some of the key elements that you see bringing together in terms of policy levers and community engagement to actually have that conversation. We are, in addition to fighting against downtown business, as Sandra mentioned, and others who have a really strong reaction to who's going to be gathering in this public space, we have a bureaucracy that is committed to a certain way of envisioning what the use of very, very wonderful space is for. So some of the key elements that might help us think through our next steps to get us moving in that direction.
Yeah. Well, there's all kinds of rules of thumb that will make it work. It has to work aesthetically. It has to be beautiful, of course. It also has to be resilient, but it can't be institutional too much. It can't make people feel like it's designed to resist their impact. In fact, being more vulnerable is a better strategy because then people feel like they're more trusted and more welcome. So there needs to be a bit of wisdom in this. Also, instead of seeing people as problems, it's so much better to see them as resources, especially the people living in the street. Yeah, a little bit of creativity here. Let's see. What we did there were some high school kids in Northwest Portland that tried to basically regenerate Stonehenge in a park, and it was a very delicate thing initially, a very delicate thing. And the kids had researched the genesis of Stonehenge, and they got permission from the Parks Bureau to do it. But at night it was vulnerable, and at the same time Dignity Village was beginning, and so. Rather than perceiving them as a potential threat, they asked the villagers if they could keep their eyes on it. Nobody ever heard that thing. In fact, to ask people to have a role and responsibility helps them to have meaning and a sense of place, and also some power, a role. And God, I mean, just to understand the profile of what's going on here, like the most horrible thing that we do to people in the streets is we make them feel invisible, like they don't matter or they don't exist. And the opposite of that, and that might well elicit some kind of reaction, I suppose. And the opposite of that would be to treat them with dignity and respect and be on a first name basis with them, and then have them have a meaningful way of engaging and a role in stewardship. And frankly, we save a whole lot of money by incentivizing constructive behavior with just a little bit of funding. That saves us a whole lot of money in terms of crisis management. As people are learning all over the country, a little bit of proactivity and a little tiny bit of funding compared to crisis management goes a long, long way and saves us lots of tax dollars. So I would say get children involved. Get children involved to help design and create and literally implement some things. And then a broad spectrum of different service groups and civic organizations for sure, and everyone having all the stakeholders having representatives in the process, and then looping back into those cultures to get feedback, so we really build the momentum and we build this like a barn raising, and then make it so that the people who are taking care of the space would tend to be the ones that are already out in the streets. And the thing is going to be taken care of like we've never seen before. I bet.
We have time for one more question. So I heard that original public square that you just started with the tea thing,
Oh yeah.
and then I heard that your city council was not letting you do that, and so y'all more or less did a direct action and started that. But if that's not true, and if you could comment, it'd be great. In addition to our city council being very bureaucratic, they're also being very duplicitous and very sneaky, and doing everything behind the public's backs as much as possible. So it would be really helpful if people came out to city council meetings, but it's really not about that. It's about they just are doing everything. So what I want to hear is when you have not just a bureaucracy, but a really controlling and duplicitous guard in there who's not really letting people know. Like, people think we have a progressive council, we don't. So how do we use other forms of self-governance without turning into like a brawl or just total polarization? How can we move this and do the things that you just talked about? But what I'm worried about is like the how-to.
Okay, well, however, I mean, I certainly sympathize with your characterization, and I also think that there'd be people who would have different points of view, but I totally respect what you're saying, and I'm not surprised because almost every town and city of any scale in this country would have a similar disconnect, especially of perception, if not, actual reality. And our prescription is basically to restore the gathering places and the political cultures that are most local. We have a metaphor for it. Like, when you go out and you cut flowers and you put them in a vase. They look great for a few days, but they're actually dying the whole time. What we're saying about our political culture is there's no wonder that it's rotted, because we've cut off the grass, the tips of the roots of the great tree of our political culture. And in doing that, it doesn't get fed with the moisture and the nutrients, the minerals that should be flowing into the body of the tree. The entire tree is depending on the tips of the rootlets in order to feed it. And the entire tree will die by disconnecting itself from its edges. And so what we're saying, to take that analogy into our own lives, there's only so much that you can do to fix a system in which we are disengaged. If the system has more layers of our participation, we will literally grow our own leadership to then grow into the scale of a town or a city where all of the subcultures or villages, you might say, get unified and brought together. And people will be more true to their roots, therefore. But about the public square you were asking about. So it's true that when we first wanted to try the idea, that we called the Department of Transportation, and they were not receptive. They said, we appealed to them. We said, there's 22,000 intersections in the city, and the villages of most people's ancestors are characterized by gathering places where people's pathways come together. Their lives are supposed to come together. That's basic urban design 101, where people's pathways converge their lives come together. And that's why you find the piazza, the platea, the plats. Every language has its own name for this nexus that occurs at that location. So we said, we're trying to create a node here in the fabric. And they said, well, we're just transportation engineers. We don't know about this stuff. And I was like, so you are in charge of most of the public space of the city and you don't know what we're talking about. And they said, yeah, and besides, it's public space, so nobody can use it. And we were like, wow, that's amazing. That's like watching the movie Brazil, where everyone's like punching themselves in the face the whole time. Like, did you hear what you just said? And they're like, oh, you're so frustrating. Why don't you just go home? You have no power. And we're like, that's the problem. We're home, and there's nowhere else to go. And besides that, you never even have come here in your life. Don't you think it's absurd that you should be able to tell us what we can and can't do, and yet you have no relationship to us? We don't even know what you look like. And he's like, duh, that's how it works. So we went downtown and we literally met with them across the table and we said, kind of duh, not anymore. Like, we're gonna do something. And they're like, whatever, the Matrix is on our side. So we just had a whole bunch of chocolate cake parties until we finally went out into the intersection, we painted the thing, we built all this stuff joyously, and then this is a true story. We started to invite Ed, the giant beat policeman, to our chocolate cake parties on Monday nights. I recommend preemptive, proactive chocolate cake strategies with your local police. Before you do anything, just build a relationship and have everybody know each other. So Ed would show up on Monday nights at 7, and 2 incredibly cute little girls would be waiting for him with chai and chocolate cake. And Ed was never late. And then he would join our little potluck on the northwest corner of our intersection and sit with us. And he thought it was community policing. And it can be that, but is that community really? So when it was time for us to take the street, Ed showed up because somebody called and complained, some condo owners 8 blocks away. And Ed showed up and he said, this is the coolest thing I have ever seen. And I'm paid to stop what's wrong, but I am not paid to stop what's right. So he said, he's like, when transportation gets mad, call the police. In your life, you should have the experience of breaking the law and having the police show up and sit on your side of the table, staring down transportation, pointing out, your own damn website says engage children to build community pride, address all these indicators for livability and sustainability, inspire people to freaking pick up trash and plant flowers if nothing else. So within 3 months, I was there the moment the mayor said to the city attorney, this is what we're doing, make it legal.
That's right.
That's when the executive power,
Wait, we're done.
or I guess we're
Look at this cute little girl right here.
The downtown big area, all the neighborhoods, which came first?
which came first? The downtown one. That was the big one that happened first. Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, we have a 2-year-old saying it's time to end here.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mr. Franz. I'm David Shaw, and I am the director of Santa Cruz Permaculture, and we've been hosting Mark in Santa Cruz for, 8 years or so. And I'm really excited that we really have a project now to kind of sink our teeth into as a community with these downtown parking lots, because there's not just one that we're talking about, there's many that are being redeveloped. So I want to encourage people to check out the booth in the back over there. Cammie, can you raise your hand? There's information about the workshop tomorrow if you want to engage and kind of workshop what could happen with this downtown Santa Cruz Commons. We have a workshop from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. on that subject, and you can find out more there. The mornings with Mark, thank you, with Mark. It's in downtown Santa Cruz. There's more information at the table in the back. And the morning is going to be more presentations and context building, and the afternoon is all about this downtown commons subject. Anything else, Rick, that we need to say? Okay.
Hi, I'm Ken Foster, and I teach the permaculture class at Cabrillo College that is starting again in the fall semester. It's a class that goes the whole semester, all Saturdays, all days Saturdays for the whole semester. And during the course, you're on a design team and you're designing a project and you're learning permaculture and this kind of stuff. And so consider taking the class there at Cabrillo.
Well, thanks very much, everybody, for coming, and this is not the beginning, but it's very close to the beginning of something that I think we all hope is going to be happening, and I hope we're all engaged in it, and I hope we all have signed up for emails and so forth, and we'll find ways of moving forward, I hope. So thanks so much.